Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. The intellectual intensity of New York was raised last year when Jeremy Travis was appointed president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Welcome.
Thank you.
I could not think of a better job for you or a better person for them.
Oh, thanks. That's very kind.
It's a remarkable institution, isn't it?
It's a great place to be, great place for me to be, and I feel very lucky.
And you trained, I mean, it started what, 47 or something, back in the 40s?
It started a little bit later than that. It's 40 years old, and it started as a police college, a liberal arts college for police officers, with the then radical idea that if you gave a good education to police officers, they'd do their job better.
Yeah. And now?
And now, fast forward, 40 years later, it's 14,000 students, 2 doctoral programs, half a dozen master's programs, 19 majors, and people coming who are, yes, we're still interested in policing and law enforcement, but also forensic science and forensic psychology and fire science and public safety generally. And
you're doing a lot of research also.
But it's, this is one of my goals for the college, is that it become a very strong research center on crime and justice and public safety questions.
You recently, I read that you recently made a speech in, where? Far East someplace,
Hong
to
Kong.
Interpol.
Hong Kong, right.
Yeah, talking with other countries about sharing experiences and communication and research and about terrorism.
Right. Well, John Jay has become an international school, and that's in part because of our student body. Many of them are immigrants or kids of immigrants. In part because of our faculty. They have research projects underway all around the world. But also in large part because of what we think about and care about and do research about and talk about in our classrooms, which is a changing world on terrorism issues and human trafficking and human rights issues. So the internationalization of the school is a very big part of what's happening right now.
And you also have an arrangement with the Dominican Republic. You're training. Are you actually going in and training their whole police force?
We just signed an agreement this week with the Secretary of the Interior and Police and Attorney General and Chief of Police of the Dominican Republic. We've worked on this for several months now, and they'll be sending some of their staff, mostly police officers, to John Jay to get some training, with the idea that when they go back to their country, they will do the training on forensic science and crime scene work and crime reduction and the like, to help that country that really needs some assistance in bringing safety to their communities.
Yeah. So John Jay is becoming an international
Right. It's very exciting. Yeah. Very exciting.
Do you, you've written this wonderful book
thank you.
With an incredible title, But They All Come Back, and you're talking about prisoners.
Right.
Do you think one of the reasons that crime is down is that police officers are being trained better?
I think policing today is smarter than it was years ago. It's much more problem focused, it's much more results oriented. Police officers have more tools, and I mean both technology kinds of tools as well as conceptual tools, ways of thinking about things. Police today are much more willing to open the conversation to other partners, social service providers, community groups, advocacy groups. So police today are basically much more professional in the way they do their work, and that has helped them develop better responses to crime.
But at the same time that they've developed and widened their awareness, the political people have not, right? I mean, have we developed, what I think in the book you say over the last 40 years or 35 years, there's been a great change in the whole criminal justice system. Explain what that changed.
You've picked up on what was a very interesting and on some level sort of troubling dichotomy. The public conversation about crime still in our country continues to be very, let's get tough, let's get retributive, let's lock him up, send him away. At the same time, on the ground, at the community level, and where police officers are doing most of their work, it's much more pragmatic, much more results-oriented, and less ideological. So that's shifted a little bit because crime rates are so low now that there's some of the pressure off. In a political sense, some of the pressure is off our elected officials to posture,
have that rigid,
to get tough. And the book came about in part because I wanted to focus my attention, but the attention of others, on this result of our getting tough over the years, which is we've ramped up the number of people we put in prison. We've quadrupled the per capita rate of people incarcerated in this country. And we've done that intentionally, slowly, year by year. The prison population has gone up as a result of our change in policy, our change in posture. And the result of that is, since we put more people in prison, more people come out, and that's the title
Hence
of the
title,
book.
right.
But they all come back. So we just have to focus on this result of our policy shift and think about what we call now prisoner reentry.
So they all come back and they re-enter society,
Right.
but then a high percentage of them go back to the
Right.
correctional institutions.
Right. So the starting point of this understanding.
How many people do we have
Right.
in prison?
We have in state and federal prisons now about 1.3, 1.4 million people. And 20 years ago it was 300,000 people.
Yeah.
So a lot more people in prison. And the public tends to forget that unless you die in prison of natural causes or you're executed, you come out at some point. And it's a little bit longer now than it used to take to get out of prison, but 95% of the people in prison now will come out. 40% of the people in prison now, as we speak, will come out within a year. So there's a fair amount of churning in and out. And the important number for this reentry conversation is about 630,000 people a year are now coming out of our state and federal prisons. We can think of that on a daily basis. It's about 1,700 people a day leave prison. And that's 4 times as many as left prison 20 years ago. So we have a lot more people putting in, a lot more people coming out, and the reentry policy conversation and the research that's being done is trying to focus on the consequences of that increase in the number of people coming in and out of prison.
There's also been a significant change, I think you note in the book, that the older, more enlightened version of what you should do in prison is to try to rehabilitate. And that today, that's not the purpose. It's really just to incarcerate,
Right.
to take them off the streets,
Right.
right? And therefore, people are being released. I'm not even saying that it was more successful in the past, but people are being released just on their own.
Right.
But some of the different things are that 3 strikes are out. What, determinate sentencing?
Mandatory minimums, abolition of parole, truth in sentencing. We've had again, if we were to go back maybe 40 years or so to the early 70s, late 60s, American criminal justice professionals and the general public and the lawmakers and the academics, we shared an idea as a country about sentencing. It was called indeterminate sentencing. That meant that the legislature set the boundaries, judges sentenced people to
It's the old 3 to 5 or
minimum and
yeah.
then a maximum,
Yeah.
and then within that a parole board made a decision when you got out, and when you got out you were basically under supervision. That consensus no longer exists in this country. So we have all these different sentencing reforms, 3 strikes, mandatory minimum, truth in sentencing and the like. So there's this patchwork quilt of sentencing policies. But irrespective of that, all those changes, and without taking a position on whether they're good or not, we still have to face the reality of reentry. They all come back. So the purpose of the book was really to it's a wake-up call to get the public and the political establishment to focus on the fact that many more people are coming back, and we've lost our focus, whatever focus we had, and we had much more in the past, we've lost our focus on the reality of reentry.
I want to go back. I want to go to the reentry, but I just wanted to ask one more question because I thought this was so interesting. You used to have that 3 to 5 or whatever it was, and then built into that were incentives for you
Right.
to make the most of your time.
Right.
So
So imagine you're sentenced to prison,
Yeah.
and you know you're going to get out on March 8th, 2010.
right.
And nothing that you do in prison is really going to change it, either to later or earlier. So we've lost an incentive. We lost an incentive structure for people to behave well. So this is not good for discipline
Right.
within the prisons. And to do the things that they can do themselves that might convince a decision maker to let them out earlier. Like participate in an educational program, or work on your skill set, or even prepare for getting out by getting housing lined up or a job lined up. So the shift away from indeterminate sentencing has had the effect of moving, in some states, not all states have made that shift, away from an incentive structure that could help people get ready to be released and help people be on good behavior while they're in.
And the other twist in that was they max out, which means they've served their full sentence, right?
Right.
So when they leave in those places where they still have parole boards or parole,
Right.
they're not even under any supervision at all.
So
if you max out, you serve your sentence and that's it.
So one of the discoveries that I made in doing this work, and as a New Yorker, I thought everybody was placed on parole, right? That everybody was released and they were placed on some sort of supervision. Well, across the country, that's not true for everybody. 80% or so of the people being released are released with supervision, but 20%, 1 in 5 of those 630,000 are released with no supervision. They have no legal status, they don't have to report to a parole officer, they're just shown the door. And for some of them, that's really bad, because somebody who maxes out because they were denied parole, because they were violent while they were in prison, or because they were in solitary, or whatever, they're just shown the door, and there's no supervision, no discharge planning, nobody responsible for their well-being while they're back in the community. Those people are a real danger to the community. So we've really done a lot of things in a crazy way.
That have no, there's
no logic,
no common sense, no logic or anything. So you're proposing a very interesting thing, and it's, in a way, it's shifting responsibility from the criminal justice system into the community. And some other things. So let's talk about it. So you get, how many, 1,700 people a day coming out?
Across the country,
They come out, a lot of them don't know where they're going to live. They've lived in families that have had problems, and they've also had poor relations with the family. They don't want them to come back. Or they've had drug programs and drug problems, and we don't have drug treatment programs in prison, right? Do we not have drug treatment programs?
Not as many. It's gone down, and not as many as we should have.
They have to find a job, and they also have to have a place to sleep. So what happens to them?
Well, I think we have to understand this transition from prison back to free society as a time of enormous stress, enormous risk. For some people who have not been out in free society for a long time, it's very disorienting and confusing. Some people coming out of prison assume the world has stood still while they were away, and they expect their family to be the same and their kids to be the same, and like coming home from being posted overseas in a military situation, you come back and no one understands what you've been through. So it's a time of enormous risk, and I like to think of that meaning that it's enormous opportunity as well. And the risks are manifest in the data. So the quick point to make here is that the failure rate for people coming out of prison is highest around the time that they get out. And we tend to forget that. We think that recidivism, this getting rearrested, happens sort of evenly over time. In fact, it happens most right after people get out. So the policy proposition that I make in the book is that if we want to reduce the failure, which means we want to reduce crime rates, we want to enhance public safety, and we want individuals coming out of prison to be more likely to be reintegrated into family and work and citizenship, then we have to focus on the time right before they get out and the time right after they get out, so that we can use that as a moment of opportunity to help them succeed. And if they succeed, society benefits.
And it's interesting because you don't put the pressure necessarily on the people operating the prison. Or on the criminal justice system. And you've cited several places. I mean, I was fascinated about the Oregon job situation. That is really interesting. Why? Tell us a little.
Well,
that's a prison activity, though.
It's a prison activity, but it involves the private sector.
Private sector, right.
So here's the little thought experiment. What could we do to try to bring the private sector into the prisons to help train inmates as they're getting ready to be released, and on jobs where if they are trained on that job, there's virtually that job waiting for them on the outside. So Oregon has done this with great success, brought in some manufacturing jobs, some computer jobs into the prison, where it's basically managed by a private business with the understanding that there's a chance that when the person comes out that they would be hired on the outside. There's work to be done to overcome some union opposition to that sort of policy, but it's a very interesting idea. So it's a way, anything we can do to create these bridges between the inside and the outside. Faith institutions can be a bridge, family can be a bridge, jobs can be a bridge.
Rhode Island with health, you cite?
Rhode Island, perfect example, in Providence, Brown University provides medical service for people in the Rhode Island prisons, and there's a continuity of health care. So it's the same doctor inside the prison and on the outside. So we tend to sort of divide up the world into prisons and the rest of society, but the reentry framework reminds us that people move across that boundary, and we can help them move across that boundary better with greater success by creating these bridges.
And when we talk about Rhode Island and Brown, prisoners come out with a lot of health problems, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. This is another. When I wrote the health chapter in the book, I just was just saddened by the levels of HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, sexually transmitted diseases, mental illness, all of them at elevated levels, 3 to 10 times higher than the population. And the question here is, since everybody comes back, and particularly on communicable diseases, what can we do while people are in prison to detect, inoculate if possible, to treat where possible, so that the communicable diseases like tuberculosis, we've done something while people are in, so that they're posing less risk to themselves and others when they get out. So
now when you establish these ties, and there are also programs working with families while the people are still in prison, and then continue to work with them when they get out of prison, right? We have one in New York?
Yeah.
La Bodega?
La Bodega de la Familia, on the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
I think families, if I were to nominate one resource that we have not tapped, it would be families. And I think that's common human understanding of the institutions that sort of keep us grounded, are families. Not all families are best for people. Right. Some of them are very destructive, and the individual in prison sometimes has been a destructive member of the family. But by and large, I would start with the proposition that families can be a partner here, with the caveat that families need resources as well. And
help, right? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So now, how do you build in the incentive system that's lacking in prison with the determinate sentencing outside? And what are your proposals for the community? Yeah. Let's explain it.
Well, I think I don't try to settle the debate. It's a long debate between determinate sentencing and indeterminate sentencing.
Just accept it.
And there it is, right? But I think the incentives are important. So I argue in the book for creating a very open and transparent set of basically good time incentives for inmates to earn time off their release date by doing things that will help prepare them for reentry. Getting in a program, staying on good behavior, having a job, and the like. That's to help them get ready, but the institution has a responsibility as well, which is to start thinking about reentry at the time that somebody comes into the prison. Even if it's 5 years from now, you can start thinking about that and getting the individual prepared for it by working with family, working with the individual, developing a reentry plan as soon as they come in. Everything should start to pick up pace when you get within 6 months of getting out, and you really start to think very systematically about health care, about jobs, about housing. Now, we've done some of these things in the past, but this is an obligation, I think, for everybody coming out, even if they're not supervised when they get out, or even if there's no parole board. That's the point. Since they all come back, from a community point of view, the community is entitled to think that its government is planning for the reentry of people who have been in the custody of the government. I think that's a common sense proposition. But then this moment of release, with this great opportunity when failure rates are high, we need to think about actually what's the handoff process? Who reaches in to take the hand of the person coming out? So this Baltimore project that I write about, where the community comes in for the exit orientation 30 days before and says, welcome home. We know that you're coming back to live amongst us again. And the family's involved, and the health care is involved, and the churches are involved. So you can do government work, but I think the community can be empowered to play a real role. So you call that a criminal justice? Is that what you call Criminal Justice Redevelopment Corporation? Yeah, right. The Justice Redevelopment Corporation. I love it. It's a great title. And then you have a court. Right. So just let's. Well, it's such a sensible, terrific plan. It's also job producing. I think, and go on. So it inspired me to get back into government. There's this policy question. Whose responsibility is it to manage successful reentry? And in the book, I answer that question two ways. I say, first of all, it's a private responsibility. It's the individual's responsibility to get ready. It's a family responsibility. It's peers and neighbors. But this is a government function. So the government function has historically been managed, to the extent it's been managed at all, by the parole system. And back in 1999, I wrote an article, my first article on this topic, where I proposed that the responsibility for reentry management should be assigned to the judiciary, that we should establish reentry courts where judges or magistrates or administrative law judges oversee this process as they do in drug courts now, as they do in domestic violence courts, as they do in community courts. Those problem-solving courts and reentry courts, and there are a number of them now around the country, have the advantage of bringing this entire process into the open, making it transparent, where the community gets involved, where there's an independent, trusted, neutral, a judge, overseeing the process, who can manage resources, who can manage sanctions very parsimoniously, who can congratulate people when they're doing well, who can be stern when they're not doing well, can engage many people in this conversation. Parole, for me, as valuable as I think this function can be, operates too much in the office, not enough in the community, too much without rules and regulations, not enough accountability. So the reentry court idea, which I recognize as a significant shift in our jurisprudence, is my answer to the question, how should we manage this whole thing differently to get very different results?
Why should an average citizen care about what happens to someone who's broken the law and been sentenced to prison?
There are lots of people coming out of prison. They are failing at very high rates, meaning that they're engaged in new criminal activity at very high rates. 2/3 of them are rearrested within 3 years. So from a very self-centered point of view, these people coming out of prison are doing enormous harm to our society and to those around them, and sometimes to themselves. So if we can achieve success on this front in terms of reducing the recidivism rate, the failure rate significantly, which I believe we can, everybody benefits.
It has a ripple effect in a whole community and a family.
And housing, healthcare, workforce development, all of these tangential social policy questions, because we put so many people in prison now. Ironically, if you care about healthcare, you have to care about reentry. If you care about housing and homelessness, you have to care about reentry.
How much does it cost a year? What is an average figure of incarceration?
25,000 a year is a conservative figure, but it's more than that.
It's billions of dollars that we spend on criminal justice.
It's 50 billion a year.
And the impact on families and on the children. Now, in domestic violence and some other things, there's always a repetitive pattern. Is the same thing with criminal behavior, or I don't know what's the term you use?
Well, the sort of fancy term is sort of intergenerational transfer, which is there's been some research on this, and what we do know is that children of people who have been involved in the justice system have high rates of delinquency and high rates of failure. But the scale of it, we just don't focus on the kids enough. We now have 2% of all minor children in this country have a parent in prison today as we speak. For African American children, it's 8%. If you add in probation and parole, not just prison, 10% of all minor children in the country today have a parent under some justice supervision.
And that's just a parent. If you go in and you talk about the family.
Families or siblings or whatever. And these effects are concentrated in a very small number of communities that are already struggling with poor health systems, poor educational systems. So the ramping up of incarceration that we talked about a few minutes ago it's a national phenomenon, but it's concentrated in a small number of communities of color, where children are trying to grow up and find their way in life, and it's now normative. It's
another illustration of the difference. I mean, with the hurricane, for instance, New Orleans, with the charges of the effects of racism, and this is certainly another effect of it.
And the consequences in a small number of communities that are overwhelmingly African American and Latino communities, this is going to have long-term effects on our country. So I make an argument in the book that there's a really social justice challenge here that we've got to just get our mind around.
You also talk about the hidden punishment, or I forget
invisible punishment.
Invisible punishment. And there was just an article about a case that the Supreme Court did not take the case from Florida that disenfranchises all ex-felons, right? And you even point out that it really would have affected the election. I don't want to bring that in, but it's all right.
It would have, no question. And many elections. There's a lot of variation among the states how they handle this question. Florida is one of the states where if you have a felony conviction, you're disqualified from voting for life. So because we have, on the one hand, increased the use of incarceration and the criminal justice system generally as a response to crime, and because that has the racially disparate effects that we talked about, in those states where the policy is that you're disqualified from voting for life, a quarter of the African American men, because it's mostly about men, a quarter of the African American men cannot vote for life.
It's incredible.
So this is not a good policy for our democracy.
What are some of the other discriminatory things that we have?
Well, the concept of invisible punishment that I develop in the book is this notion that our legislatures, while they've gotten tougher on sentencing generally, have also gotten tougher in saying that people who are criminals, who are convicted of crimes, are barred from certain privileges that others would be have access to. Some of them are important, very important privileges like voting. Others are barriers to employment. You can't get certain jobs. You can't get student loans. You are disqualified from public housing under the one-strike law. You are disqualified from access to various benefits, driver's licenses and the like. So this network of invisible punishment makes it more difficult for people who have criminal convictions, and there are more of them, to just get back on their feet
to successfully
and to be right. So the reintegration, which is long-term the goal, because at some point people age out of this crime life. The ultimate reintegration is hampered.
So we've come to the end of this discussion, and I haven't even gotten to the politics of all of this and how we can create the will to change these different legislative things and also community actions. One final question. Is John Jay, do you see this as being a leader in trying to change policies? We
have established a Prisoner Reentry Institute. One of my first things I did when I got to John Jay, we hired a terrific director, Debbie Muckamull, from the Legal Action Center. The politics have shifted on punishment generally. There's now a broad bipartisan coalition with people ranging from the Congressional Black Caucus to the religious right, pushing legislation to bring attention and resources to this issue.
So that's a hopeful way to end this program.
I think so.
Thank you very much, and much good luck to you.
Good.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.